As I stood between the twin caskets of my mother and my father, the man I had been married to for 40 years chose that exact moment to lean in, his breath warm against my ear, and whisper that he wanted a divorce because, in his words, I was now officially bankrupt. Hi everyone. My name is Audrey, and some of you here know me as Grandma Audrey. I'm 70 years old, speaking to you today from a small condo overlooking the ocean, a place that holds a story you would never believe. This is a story I've never told a soul. Not my closest friends, not even my own 2 children. They know parts of it, of course. They know their father left me. But they don't know when he left me. They don't know why he left me. And they certainly don't know what happened next. For years, the shame of that moment, the sheer calculated cruelty of it, was a secret I guarded as if it were my own failing. I felt contaminated by it. I thought revealing the truth would be like admitting how little I was worth, that after a lifetime together, my value could be calculated on a balance sheet and found lacking. But I've learned that secrets are not meant to be kept. They are burdens meant to be set down. And today, I'm setting this one down for good. Before I begin this difficult journey back in time, I would be so grateful if you would do me a small kindness. Please, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Knowing there is a community of kind hearts listening gives me the courage to unlock a door I have kept bolted shut for so long. Your support is a light in the darkness. Thank you. To understand the darkness of that day, you must first understand the light that came before it. My story doesn't begin at a funeral. It begins in a small, love-filled house with 2 of the most wonderful people you could ever meet, my parents. My story began in the year 1975, when I married Richard. But the foundation of my life was built by my mother and father. They were high school teachers. My father taught history, and my mother taught English literature. They weren't wealthy people, not by any stretch of the imagination. Gosh, no. They were the most frugal, sensible, down-to-earth people I have ever known. They drove the same modest car for 20 years, its engine sputtering but reliable. My mother was the queen of coupons, and she could make a single chicken last for 3 different meals. Our house was small and tidy, filled not with expensive things, but with books. Books were everywhere, piled on tables, overflowing from shelves, tucked into corners. They believed that a wealth of knowledge was far more valuable than a wealth of money. Their love was quiet and constant, a soft, steady hum that was the background music of my entire childhood. They were my rock. When I brought Richard home to meet them, they were instantly charmed. And who wouldn't be? Richard back then was like a hero out of a novel. He was handsome, ambitious, and working his way up at a large investment firm. He had a brilliant smile and a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He talked to my father about history and politics, and he quoted poetry to my mother. He treated them with such respect, such deference. He saw my simple, loving family, and he told me it was everything he'd ever wanted. Our life together for nearly 40 years was the picture of happiness. We had 2 wonderful children, a son and a daughter, and raised them in a lovely home in the suburbs. Richard was a fantastic provider. He was so smart with money, or so I thought. Early in our marriage, he sat me down. "Audrey, my love," he'd said, taking my hands in his. "You have a creative soul. You shouldn't have to worry your pretty head about mortgages and taxes. Let me handle it. I'm good with numbers. It's what I do. You just focus on making our life beautiful." And I was so grateful. It felt like an act of profound love and protection. I was an artist. I painted. I sculpted. I made our home a warm and welcoming place. And I never had to worry about a single bill. He handled all the investments, all the bank accounts. I would sign whatever papers he put in front of me, trusting him implicitly. Our finances were a black box that I never once thought to look inside. Why would I? I had a loving, capable husband who was taking care of everything. We were a team. He was the head, and I was the heart. It seemed like a perfect partnership. He was a wonderful son-in-law, too. He never forgot my parents' anniversary. He would send them flowers on my mother's birthday. He would spend hours helping my father in garden. When their old car finally gave up the ghost, Richard insisted on buying them a new one. A safe, reliable sedan. "It's the least I can do," he'd said, waving off their protests. "You've given me the greatest gift of my life," he would add, looking at me. My heart would swell with pride. I had chosen such a good man. Such a kind, generous man. The contrast between my life with Richard and my parents' life was stark. We had the big house, the nice vacations, the new cars. They had their little bungalow, their coupon clippings, their library books. Richard often remarked on it, with a tone of fond pity. "Your parents are wonderful, Audrey, but they just don't know how to enjoy life," he'd say. "They've worked so hard and have so little to show for it. It's a shame." I never questioned that narrative. It was what I saw with my own eyes. My parents were good, humble people who were, by all accounts, poor. This dynamic, this seemingly perfect life, continued for decades. The children grew up and moved out. Richard's career soared. I continued with my art. And my parents grew old, their love for each other as steadfast as ever. And then, everything changed. It happened with a terrifying speed. It started with my father. A sudden massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. My mother, fiercely loyal and loving, refused to put him in a home. "I will take care of my husband," she insisted. But the strain of being a full-time caregiver to the man she loved, watching him decline day by day, took its toll. Her own health, which had always been robust, began to fail. It was her heart. It was literally breaking under the strain. Within 6 months of my father's stroke, my mother had a catastrophic heart attack. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was gone. And my father, lying in his bed at home, without his beloved wife by his side, for the first time in over 50 years, he just gave up. He passed away less than 24 hours later. The doctors called it a broken heart. They left this world as they had lived in it, together. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight that made it impossible to breathe. Losing one parent is a tragedy. Losing them both at once, it's an amputation of the soul. It was in the midst of this suffocating fog of sorrow that I leaned on my husband, my rock, my partner of 40 years. And it was then that he began to show his true colors. In the immediate aftermath of my parents' deaths, the world felt like a dream, a hazy, distorted, slow-motion nightmare. The grief was so immense, so all-consuming, that it was hard to focus on the practicalities. The phone calls, the arrangements, the paperwork, it was all a blur. Through it all, I assumed Richard would be my anchor, the steady hand guiding me through the storm. He had always been so good in a crisis, so capable. But the man who stood beside me during those first few days was a stranger. At first, it was just a distance, a coldness that was utterly alien to our 40-year partnership. When I would break down in a fresh wave of tears, he wouldn't pull me into his arms as he always had. He would stand there, a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, and say things like, "Audrey, you need to pull yourself together. There's a lot to do." His voice wasn't gentle. It was impatient, as if my grief were an inconvenient delay in a busy schedule. I tried to excuse his behavior. He's grieving too, in his own way, I told myself. He loved them too. Men just process these things differently. I clung to that explanation like a lifeline, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I needed him to be the man I had married. I needed him to be my rock. But the rock I was clinging to was turning into a block of ice. Little by little the comments started. They were subtle at first. Casual remarks dropped into the conversation that made my stomach clench with a strange, unfamiliar anxiety. We were at my parents' little house, the day after their passing, trying to find their important documents for the funeral home. The house was so still, so full of their absence, it felt like a physical presence. I was looking through my mother's meticulously organized desk when Richard let out a heavy, frustrated sigh. "Good Lord, Audrey," he said, shaking his head, as he looked through a folder of my father's old bank statements. "I knew they were frugal, but this is, well, it's just sad. They had nothing. Absolutely nothing to show for a lifetime of work. His words, meant to sound sympathetic, landed like a judgment. He was talking about my parents, the kindest, most content people I had ever known, and he was pitying them, dismissing their entire lives as a financial failure. They had each other, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. They had a happy life. Happiness doesn't pay the bills, he retorted, his voice sharp. He tossed the folder onto the desk. And now we're the ones who have to pay them. The funeral costs alone are going to be significant. A cold fear, completely separate from my grief, began to creep into the edges of my heart. We had always been comfortable. Richard was a successful investment manager. Funerals were expensive, yes, but I had never, not once in 40 years, heard him speak of any expense as a burden. We had paid for our children's university education, for lavish family vacations, for 2 cars in the garage, all without him ever breaking a sweat. Why was this, the cost of honoring my parents, suddenly a problem? The pressure escalated over the next few days. The funeral planning became an exercise in his new cruel form of accounting. I wanted to choose the beautiful white lilies my mother had adored. He vetoed them. An unnecessary expense, he declared. Daisies are cheaper. I wanted a beautiful memorial book for people to sign. A waste of paper, he countered. No one looks at those things anyway. Every choice I tried to make, every small detail I wanted to honor my parents' memory, was met with his cold, fiscal logic. He framed it as being sensible, as making the kind of prudent decisions my parents themselves would have made. But it didn't feel prudent. It felt punitive. It felt like he was punishing me, punishing my parents, for not having the foresight to save up for their own deaths. My inner monologue was a swirling vortex of confusion and pain. What is wrong with him? Why is he acting like this? Is our financial situation not what I thought it was? Are we in trouble? But I couldn't bring myself to ask. For 40 years, I had trusted him completely with our finances. To question him now felt like a betrayal of our entire life together. And a deeper, more cowardly part of me was terrified of the answer. So, I said nothing. I deferred to his choices. My parents had a funeral with daisies instead of lilies, and my heart ached with a silent, secret shame. The night before the funeral, we were sitting in our living room. Our beautiful, expensive living room, with the silk curtains and the leather sofas, a room that suddenly felt cold and alien to me. I was numb with grief, staring into the empty fireplace. Richard cleared his throat. Audrey, we need to talk. I turned to look at him. His face was a hard, unreadable mask. There was none of the love, none of the sympathy I so desperately needed to see there. This situation, with your parents, it's brought some things to a head, he began, his voice cold and formal, like he was addressing a client. The cost of the funeral, the settling of their estate, which, as we know, is non-existent, it's put a significant strain on our finances. My stomach dropped. A strain. But I thought we were fine. You've always been so successful. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Success is relative, Audrey. I've managed to maintain a certain lifestyle for us, yes. But it requires careful management. We don't have unlimited resources. And this unexpected, major expense, it's a problem. He made it sound as though my parents had been reckless, as though their simultaneous deaths were an irresponsible act designed specifically to inconvenience him. I don't understand, Richard, I whispered, my world beginning to tilt on its axis. What are you saying? He stood up and began to pace, his movements agitated, angry. What I'm saying is that for years, I have been carrying the financial weight for everyone. For us, for our children, and in many ways, for your parents. That little car I bought them, the vacations I sent them on, that all came out of my pocket. Our pocket. I never complained. But I was, in effect, subsidizing their lifestyle. And my mind reeled. The acts of generosity I had been so proud of, he was now reframing as a burden. He he had silently shouldered for years. He was taking my beautiful memories and twisting them into a narrative of his own quiet martyrdom. I never knew, I stammered. Of course you didn't, he said, his voice dripping with a condescension I had never heard from him before. You were busy with your painting, your sculpting. You were busy making things beautiful. You never had to look at the ugly numbers on the page. That was my job. He stopped pacing and stood before me, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was a mixture of pity and contempt. The bottom line, Audrey, is that your inheritance is a pile of debt. Your parents left you nothing but bills. You, as their only child, are now responsible for that. And by extension, so am I. Your family's financial incompetence has now become my problem. His words were a physical blow. Your family. Your inheritance. He was drawing a line, separating me and my simple, loving parents from him and his world of success and careful management. For 40 years, we had been a team, a single unit. Now, in the space of a few cruel sentences, he had cleaved our partnership in two. He saw the shattered look on my face, and for a moment, a flicker of something that might have been his old self appeared. He sat down and took my hand. His touch was cool. Look, he said, his voice softening slightly, but it was a calculated softness. We'll get through this, but things are going to have to change. We're going to have to be much, much more careful. The lifestyle you've become accustomed to. We may have to make some adjustments. He was laying the groundwork. He was preparing me. But for what? I didn't know. I went to bed that night, feeling a dread so profound, it was like a physical weight on my chest. I was about to bury my parents, and I felt with a chilling certainty that I was about to bury my marriage too. The man sleeping in the bed beside me, the man whose hand I had held for 40 years, was a stranger. And he was a stranger who was looking at me, for the first time, as a liability. The day of the funeral was a blur of gray. A cold, persistent drizzle fell from a colorless sky, mirroring the utter desolation in my soul. Getting dressed was an act of Herculean effort. The black dress I chose felt heavy, like a shroud. Looking at my reflection in the mirror was like looking at a stranger. A woman with hollowed-out eyes and a face etched with a grief so profound, it seemed to have aged me a decade in just a few days. Richard was already dressed, standing by the window, sipping a cup of coffee, his back to me. He was dressed in his finest suit, a dark, impeccably tailored charcoal gray tatting. He looked less like a grieving son-in-law and more like a CEO about to attend a difficult but necessary board meeting. He turned as I entered the room, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. There was no softness in his gaze, no shared sorrow. It was an appraisal. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice brisk. "The limo will be here in 10 minutes. We can't be late." The limo? Another one of his choices. It felt so ostentatious, so wrong for my simple, humble parents. But I had no fight left in me. I just nodded, a silent, hollowed-out doll. The ride to the church was silent. I stared out the window at the rain-streaked streets, my hands twisting a damp handkerchief in my lap. Richard sat beside me, but he could have been a million miles away. He spent the entire ride tapping away on his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't grieving. He was working. He was managing his assets, solving problems, moving forward. And I, and the immense suffocating grief that filled the car, we were just part of the day's inconvenient schedule. The service itself is a fragmented memory, a series of painful, disconnected snapshots. The heavy scent of the daisies he had insisted on, a scent I will forever associate with this day. The solemn, kind face of the minister, his words of comfort washing over me without sinking in. The faces of my children in the front pew, their own grief so raw and real, a painful mirror of my own. I wanted to reach out and hold them, to draw comfort from them, but I was frozen in my own private bubble of misery. Richard sat beside me, stoic and impassive, a perfect model of dignified sorrow. But I knew it was a performance. His body was there, but his soul, his heart, was somewhere else entirely. He was a brilliant actor, and this was just another role to be played. The hardest part was walking past their caskets. They were closed. Another one of his sensible decisions. Side by side, just as they had been in life. My mother and my father. My beginning and my end. The finality of it was a physical blow. My knees buckled, and for a moment, I thought I would collapse. My son, seeing my distress, reached out and took my arm, his strong, youthful grip, the only thing holding me upright. I looked at Richard, expecting, hoping for a sign, a glance, a shred of shared humanity. He was looking straight ahead, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. He was unmoved. It was at the graveside that the final, unthinkable act of cruelty occurred. We stood under a large black umbrella, the rain drumming a mournful rhythm against the taut fabric. The caskets were poised over the 2 empty plots of earth. The minister was saying the final prayers. The words ashes to ashes, dust to dust, echoed in the damp air. My grief was a raw, open wound. My body was trembling, and a low, keening sound escaped my throat, a sound I was not even aware I was making. It was the sound of a heart breaking. It was then, at that precise moment of my absolute ultimate vulnerability, that he chose to strike. He leaned in close to me, his body shielding his words from our children, who stood on my other side. I thought, for a fleeting, foolish second, that he was going to whisper a word of comfort. I thought he was going to tell me it would be okay. His lips brushed against my ear. His breath was warm, a shocking, intimate sensation in the cold, damp air. And this is what he whispered. "Audrey," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm murmur. "I can't do this anymore. This whole situation, it's been the final straw. Your parents' debts, this financial disaster. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and now is the time. I want a divorce." The world stopped. The sound of the rain, the minister's voice, the weeping of my daughter, it all faded into a roaring, white noise. I must have misheard him. He couldn't have said that. Not now. Not here. It was a grief-induced hallucination. I turned my head slightly, my eyes wide with a desperate, uncomprehending horror. I looked at his face. He was still looking straight ahead at the caskets, his profile as impassive as stone. But he wasn't finished. "Let's be honest," he continued, his whisper a venomous stream in my ear. "Our partnership was based on a certain equilibrium. I provided a lifestyle, and you, well, you were you. But that equilibrium is gone. Your family has left you with nothing. You are, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. And I'm sorry, but I'm a wealthy man. I cannot have a bankrupt wife. It's bad for business. It's bad for my reputation." Bankrupt.I. The word hung in the air between us, obscene and surreal. He was casting me aside, like a bad investment, like a company whose stock had plummeted. My worth, in his eyes, had never been about my love, my art, my soul, our shared history. It had been a number on a balance sheet. And with my parents gone, my perceived value had dropped to 0. I felt a strange, chilling numbness spread through my limbs, starting from my feet and moving up, a cold tide of shock that was so profound it displaced the grief. I was no longer sad. I was nothing. I was a hollowed-out shell. He finally turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were not angry. They were not sad. They were clear, cold, and calculating. It was the look of a man closing a deal. "Don't worry," he said, as if it were a kindness. "I'll be fair. I'll make sure you're taken care of within reason. We'll sell the house, split the assets, but we are done. I'll have my lawyer contact you next week to begin the proceedings." He squeezed my arm then, a gesture that was not for me, but for our children, for the small crowd of mourners watching us. A public performance of a supportive husband comforting his grieving wife. And then he turned his attention back to the ceremony, as if he had just commented on the weather. I stood there, between the graves of my parents and the man who had just buried my heart alongside them. The minister finished his prayer. The first shovel of dirt hit a casket lid with a dull, hollow thud. And I felt nothing. The grief was gone, replaced by a void so vast and so absolute it had no name. He had chosen the moment of my greatest pain to deliver the most devastating blow. He hadn't just ended our marriage. He had desecrated it. He had taken 40 years of my life, 40 years of my love, and declared it, in the shadow of my parents' graves, utterly and completely bankrupt. The ride home from the cemetery was a silent tableau of agony. I sat pressed against the cold leather of the limousine, staring unseeingly at my own reflection in the rain-streaked window. I was acutely aware of Richard beside me, of the space between us, which felt like a vast frozen chasm. He didn't speak. He didn't touch me. He had delivered his verdict, and as far as he was concerned, the conversation was over. He had moved on. He was already in the future, a future that did not include me. The house, when we returned, was filled with well-meaning friends and neighbors who had come to pay their respects. They brought casseroles and sympathy cards. The air was thick with the low murmur of condolences and the smell of baked ham. It was a living nightmare. I had to stand there, nodding and accepting their pity, while my husband, my executioner, stood by my side, playing the part of the grieving, supportive spouse to perfection. He would pat my back, refill my glass of water, and speak in low, somber tones about what a wonderful couple my parents had been. Every word he uttered was a lie. Every gesture was a performance. And I was his unwilling co-star in this grotesque play. My children, bless their hearts, were wrapped in their own cocoons of grief. They saw their father's supportive performance and took it at face value. "Dad is being so strong for you, Mom," my daughter whispered to me at one point, squeezing my hand. I just nodded, a fresh wave of betrayal washing over me. He wasn't just deceiving me, he was deceiving them too. He was poisoning my relationship with my own children, turning their perception of him into another weapon against me. But how could I possibly tell them the truth? "Your father just asked me for a divorce while we were burying my parents." It sounded insane. It sounded like something a grief-maddened woman would invent. He had chosen his moment with surgical, diabolical precision. I escaped upstairs as soon as I could, pleading exhaustion. I locked myself in our bedroom. My bedroom, I thought with a jolt, and sank onto the bed. The numbness was a mercy. It held the raw, screaming agony at bay. I felt disconnected, as if I were watching a movie of someone else's life falling apart. The woman whose husband had just discarded her like a piece of trash, the woman whose world had been shattered into a million pieces. I couldn't connect with her. The shock was a thick wall of glass between me and my own heart. The days that followed were lived in that same disassociated fog. Richard moved into the guest room. He said it was to give me space to grieve, another beautiful, noble lie that our children accepted without question. The reality was that he was disentangling himself from me, from our life, with a chilling efficiency. He was polite. He was cordial. He treated me with the cool, detached kindness one might show a distant colleague who had suffered a bereavement. He was erasing 40 years of intimacy, as if he were wiping a slate clean. He started bringing home large cardboard boxes from his office. He began to sort through his things, packing up his books, his files, his clothes. The house was filled with the sound of packing tape being ripped from the roll, a sound that, to me, was the sound of my life being sealed up and shipped away. He talked about selling the house as if it were a foregone conclusion. "We'll need to get a good realtor," he'd say at the dinner table, not looking at me. "The market is strong right now. We should be able to get a good price. It will be a good starting point for our new arrangements." Our new arrangements. That's what he called the demolition of our life. I was paralyzed. I was a ghost in my own home, watching as he dismantled everything we had built. The final straw, the thing that finally pierced through the thick fog of my shock, was a simple, practical task. It was the mail. About a week after the funeral, I was sorting through the sympathy cards and the bills, and I came across a thick, manila envelope addressed to the estate of my parents. It was from their lawyer, an old friend of my father's named Mr. Henderson. The letter inside informed me that as the executor of their estate, I needed to come to his office to sign some final papers and to collect the keys to their house, which needed to be cleaned out and prepared for sale to cover their outstanding debts, as Richard had so cruelly put it. The thought of going back to that house, to the empty, silent space that had once been the vibrant heart of my world, was an agony I could barely contemplate. Richard, of course, had no intention of going with me. "That's really something you should handle, Audrey," he said when I showed him the letter. "I'm swamped with work, and frankly, I don't think I could bear it. You're stronger than you think." Another lie. He wasn't sparing himself the pain. He was absolving himself of the responsibility. It was my family, my problem. He had already moved on. So I went alone. I drove my car to their little street, the street I had known my entire life. Walking up the path to their front door felt like walking up to a cliff edge. I put the key in the lock, the key I had used 1,000 times, and the sound of the bolt turning echoed in the silence like a gunshot. The air inside was still and stale, thick with the scent of old books and my mother's lavender potpourri. It was the smell of home, and it was a dagger to my heart. The house was exactly as they had left it. My mother's reading glasses were on the table next to her favorite chair. My father's worn slippers were by the door. It was as if they had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. I sank into my mother's chair, and for the first time since the funeral, the numbness shattered. The glass wall broke, and the grief, the raw, unfiltered, screaming grief, came for me. I put my head in my hands and I sobbed. I wept for my parents. I wept for my broken marriage. I wept for the woman I used to be, the happy, trusting, naive woman who had thought her life was perfect. I wept until I had no tears left, until I was just a hollow, aching void. After a long time, I forced myself to move. I had a job to do. I had to sort through their life, to pack up their memories, to erase them from this place, just as Richard was erasing me from ours. I started in their bedroom, in my father's closet. He was a simple man. He had a few old suits, some worn sweaters. Tucked away on the top shelf, I found a small, heavy, locked metal box. I recognized it immediately. It was his important papers, box got out. I had no idea where the key was. I carried it out to the kitchen and set it on the table. I spent the next hour just touching things, remembering. I opened my mother's jewelry box. It contained a few simple, sentimental pieces. Her mother's locket, a string of pearls from my father, her simple gold wedding band. There was nothing of monetary value. Richard was right. They had nothing. Defeated, I sat back down at the kitchen table. My eyes landed on the locked metal box. It felt like the last secret, the last piece of them I had yet to uncover. On a whim, I went to the junk drawer in the kitchen, the drawer every family has, filled with old keys, rubber bands, and mismatched screws. My mother, in her infinite frugal wisdom, never threw away an old key. I pulled out the tangled mass of them. I tried one key, then another, then another. None of them fit. I was about to give up when my fingers brushed against a small, ornate, slightly rusty key at the very bottom of the drawer. It looked different from the others. I took it back to the box. I slid it into the lock. It turned. With a soft click, the box opened. My heart was pounding. I didn't know what I expected to find. More old bank statements. The deed to the house? Instead, the box was filled with documents that made no sense to me. They were old, brittle stock certificates for companies I had never heard of. There were dozens of them. Tucked beneath them was a small, leather-bound ledger, and on top of the ledger was a single, sealed envelope. In my mother's beautiful, familiar cursive was a single word: Audrey Dot. My breath caught in my throat. Another letter from beyond the grave. With trembling fingers, I tore it open. The letter inside was short. My dearest Audrey, if you are reading this, then your father and I are gone, and your heart is broken. I am so sorry for your pain, but I am also so worried for your future. Your husband, Richard, he is a man who loves money more than he loves people. We have seen it for years. We tried to warn you, in our own quiet way, but you were too in love to see it. We were not poor, my darling. We were rich. Rich, in a way Richard could never understand. Your father was a brilliant man. He didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust flashy investment managers. He trusted history. Decades ago, he took his small inheritance and invested it in quiet, forgotten stocks, companies that owned land, railroads, resources. He never sold. He just held on. These certificates are our life's work. They are our real legacy, and they are all yours. The ledger will explain everything. Do not tell Richard. Do not trust him. This is your independence. This is your power. Take it and build a new life, a life of your own. We love you more than words can say. Your loving mother. I stared at the letter, my mind reeling. I looked at the stock certificates. I opened the ledger. The pages were filled with my father's neat, precise handwriting, detailing decades of purchases, splits, and dividends. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers that were so large, so astronomical, they seemed like fiction. It wasn't a nest egg. It was a dragon's hoard. A fortune. A massive, secret, life-altering fortune. And Richard had just divorced me because I was bankrupt. A sound escaped my throat. It was a sound I had never made before. It was a laugh. A wild, hysterical, tear-soaked laugh of disbelief and pure, unadulterated, glorious irony. He had made the biggest miscalculation of his entire money-obsessed life. And I stood alone in my parents' quiet little kitchen, holding the proof. I was not bankrupt. I was the richest woman he had ever known. And he had just set me free. In that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of my parents' frugal, simple life, the woman who had been shattered at the graveside died, and a new woman was born. The shock, the grief, the numbness, it all coalesced into a single blazing point of crystalline clarity. It was the kind of clarity that comes only when you have lost everything, only to discover you have been given the entire world. My first feeling wasn't rage. It was an almost divine sense of irony. It was so perfect, so poetic in its cruelty and its justice, that I couldn't help but laugh. Richard, the brilliant investment manager, the man who sneered at my parents' financial naivete, the man who could appraise a life in dollars and cents, had been blind to the greatest investment he had ever been a part of. He had dismissed my parents as poor, when in fact, they had been wealthier than he could ever dream of being. He had divorced me for being bankrupt at the very moment I had unknowingly become one of the wealthiest women in the state. That hysterical laugh slowly subsided, and what replaced it was a feeling I hadn't felt in decades: power. Not the loud, arrogant power that Richard wielded, but a quiet, deep, unshakable power that came from the very core of my being. It was the power of knowledge, the power of a secret. My parents, with their love and their foresight, had armed me for the battle I didn't even know I was facing. My fight back didn't begin with a phone call to a lawyer. It began with a quiet act of devotion and a promise. I carefully placed the stock certificates and the precious ledger back into the metal box. I closed the lid, locked it, and tucked the small rusty key deep into my pocket. This was my armor. This was my inheritance, and I would protect it with my life. I spent the rest of that day not packing, but communing with my parents. I made a pot of tea and sat in my mother's chair, and I read her letter over and over again. I talked to them, out loud, in the silent, dusty house. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for protecting me." I felt their presence, their love, their strength, surrounding me like a warm blanket. I was not alone. When I left the house that evening, I locked the door behind me, and I knew I would never be back. But I wasn't running away. I was advancing. The next morning, the performance began. My performance. When Richard came down for breakfast, he found me sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in my hands. I looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, I met his gaze directly. I made sure my eyes were still puffy from crying, my expression still one of shattered, helpless grief. I had to let him believe he had won. I had to let him believe I was broken. It was the only way my plan would work. "Good morning," I said, my voice quiet and weak. "Audrey," he said, surprised to see me acting almost normal. "How are you feeling?" Okay," I lied. "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. We need to be practical. We need to move forward." A look of immense relief washed over his face. He had been expecting a fight, tears, hysterics. My quiet, defeated acquiescence was exactly what he wanted. It fed his ego, his sense of control. "I'm glad you see it that way," he said, patting my shoulder in a horribly condescending gesture. "It's for the best. It will be better for both of us in the long run." The divorce proceedings began, just as he had planned. He hired the best, most aggressive divorce lawyer in the city. He presented me with a list of my own lawyers to choose from, all of whom, I later discovered, were known for being easily intimidated by his firm. I chose the one he recommended the most. In that first meeting with my new lawyer, I played my part. I was the grieving widow, the discarded wife, confused by the legal jargon, overwhelmed by the process. I let Richard and his lawyer lead the entire conversation. They laid out their terms. They would sell the house. They would split the proceeds, 50-50. They would do an appraisal of all our shared assets. The art I had created, the furniture, the cars. Richard was being, in his lawyer's words, extremely generous. He was offering me a settlement that would allow me to live comfortably, he said. A small apartment, a modest car. Enough to live on, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle he had given me. I listened, I nodded, and I agreed to everything. I signed the preliminary papers, my hand trembling for effect. Richard left that meeting looking smug, triumphant, and utterly convinced of his own brilliance. He had successfully, and with minimal fuss, shed his bankrupt wife. What he didn't know was that I had made a phone call before that meeting. A call not to the lawyer he had chosen, but to another one. A name I had gotten from Mr. Henderson, my parents' old lawyer. His name was Arthur Jensen, and he was known as the shark of the financial litigation world. I had met with Mr. Jensen in secret. I had shown him the letter. I had shown him the ledger. His eyes had lit up with a predatory glee. "Mrs. Collins," he had said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "this is the most beautiful case I have seen in 20 years. We are going to let him build the entire gallows. We will let him choose the rope. And then, at the very last moment, we will hand him the noose." So I played the fool. For weeks, I let Richard believe he was in complete control. I let him sell our house. I let him appraise our assets. I let him draw up the final, ironclad divorce decree, a document that would sever our lives completely. He was so sure of my financial ruin, so confident in his assessment of my parents' worthlessness, that he insisted on a clause in the agreement. A clause that stated that any and all inheritances received by either party before the final date of the divorce were to be considered separate property, not subject to division. He was protecting himself from my parents' imaginary debts. In reality, he was building the walls of his own prison. The final divorce hearing was scheduled. It was the day we would both sign the final decree in front of a judge. Richard was relaxed, charming, even a little bit pitying towards me. He thought he was minutes away from his freedom. He had no idea that my real lawyer, the shark, was waiting in the hallway. He had no idea what was about to happen. He had written the entire play, directed every scene, but he had no idea that I had completely rewritten the final act. Love you all. This is Grandma Audrey, and I'll see you in the next story.